with its gambling review. My name is Martha Gill. We're privileged to be joined by a panel of experts. Sir Ian Duncan-Smith is on his way. He's one of the leading voices on gambling reform in Parliament and Vice Chair of APPG on gambling-related harm. We have Professor Henrietta Bowden-Jones, National Clinical Advisor on gambling harms. We have Rafi Naik, solicitor and leader in the field of data protection and human rights in the digital age, and Matt Dove-Cousin, leading campaigner who's campaigned for reform for many years. The main question for today is this. The government launched a review of gambling laws 2 years ago. We heard in July that a white paper was ready to be published, but since then it has gone rather quiet. With the government changing policy over obesity and online harms, the question is now, what does this mean for gambling reform? Saeed is on his way. He also has to leave a little early, so I will come to him when he arrives. And then proceed the rest of the panel. And I should point out, before we begin, this is being streamed on YouTube. So bear that in mind when asking questions, and far exit is behind you. So coming first to Professor Bowden-Jones, you're an expert on the medical harms of gambling. What can the government realistically do to minimise these, and what would be your policy for reform?
Thank you, Martha. Can everyone hear? There's no microphone. Great. So I've prepared just a little summary to give you a really concise idea. So as a newly appointed National Expert Advisor on Gambling Harms, it's a pleasure to be here today, and thank you to the SMS for inviting us. My main hope is to get the message across to all of you in this room and to those watching virtually that the white paper is a vital component of the gambling reform this country has been working towards since the failures of the 2005 Gambling Act. I set up my clinic 15, 16 years ago. It has been that long we've been working towards it. The white paper has been severely delayed. Our greatest concern is that this government may not take all our recommendations on board as it sets out on publishing their version. Many people and organizations have contributed to the information gathering over the past few years. And if anyone in this room is uncertain as to what a white paper with teeth might look like, there are the Peers for Gambling Reform and the APPG reports to look at to give you a clear indication. So I hope to see the full and undiluted version of this document as set out by Chris Philp during his time in office. And what would it look like? What would we need to focus on urgently? Well, starting with affordability assessments, moving on to online stake limits, advertising restrictions, the appointment of an independent ombudsman, an independent research program to obtain the best evidence on the relationship between gambling and suicide and set out preventative measures. And most importantly, the implementation of a statutory levy to fund treatment, research, and public health initiatives. Lastly, many of the recommendations do not need a change in legislation to be implemented. They need government officials to understand gambling harms and work with us and the Gambling Commission in their implementation. Thank you.
So what is your feeling about how, you've spoken to some of the people in government who are involved in pushing this through, what is your feeling about how, what the hope is for it to get through a little bit further?
I have been extremely optimistic in recent, about a year ago, I was optimistic that by the summer we would have seen something properly produced that would have taken into account all the contributions. The contributions range from people with lived experience, people who've suffered harm and their families, all the way to clinicians, to researchers, to politicians, to people in policy making and public health. Everyone has given their bit. And my understanding was that a lot of this was actually in that paper. But right now, I have no idea. No one has been in touch to tell us how long we will have to wait, how long more we have to wait for this.
So in terms of the harms currently being done by the state of the laws as they are now, could you just sort of sketch out a picture for us and then tell us if the paper is in the shape that it was in July, tell us the impact that might have?
So I'm not in a position or privileged position to have seen that paper. What I can say is, in terms of harms, there are some positives as well in relation to the clinical side. And speaking with my clinical advisor hat, I will say there has been national coverage planned by NHS England and now mostly accomplished in relation to delivering evidence-based NHS treatment across the whole of the country. There will be a couple more clinics being added, and we'll have 15 in all by 2024. These NHS clinics are going to be working seamlessly with non-stat providers such as GamCare, Gordon Moody, and many, many others, and indeed all the other NHS units that are witnessing comorbidity and depression and anxiety that they're dealing with in these patients. So from a clinical perspective, there is a lot of harm, and NHS England is trying to address this, but there are much bigger issues that need to be addressed that are to protect people who have not experienced harm as yet.
On that, so what would be your ideal policy if you could wave a magic wand and have certain changes come in? What would you like to see?
I think I'd like to see far more accountability on the part of industry in relation to when things go wrong, punishments that are adequately and proportionately decided upon by the Commission so that it is not worth it for them to break these rules that we read about in the papers regularly. I'd like us to be able to also use large data sets to understand how to identify people who are really at risk, and in order for preventative measures and stopping people from spending all their earnings of the year in a few weeks. That kind of thing eventually trickles down to clinical harm, and if we can stop it early, that would be great. I also feel that, as I mentioned earlier, there are issues around advertising about an environment that is so toxic in relation to visual cues that may bring on a whole new generation and many more after that of people who are influenced and feel that gambling is a normalized activity on which money, their weekly money, needs to be spent in order to fit in with their peers. So there are many, many things, but I do believe that the independent levy to allow independence from industry to address issues in a research-based, evidence-based way is probably my biggest task. I think that I can give you the example of suicide and gambling. We keep on talking about how many people die from suicide each year. The fact is, we don't know because we don't have the right research at hand now. We can't extrapolate from Swedish studies, Norwegian studies. It doesn't work this way. And we need independent funds to be able to answer the big questions that allow us then to protect the whole population and indeed target the most specific help for people who have already been harmed by gambling.
And just final question for you before I move on to the next panelist. That was really interesting, your last answer about the research that needs to be done to actually investigate some of these harms. There are lots of scary statistics out there that we're all aware of, but there is still quite a lot of research to be done. I mean, what about some long-term damage to mental health, for example? Do you think there needs to be more research there, not just in terms of suicide, but also in other kinds of...
Thank you for asking me this question. I haven't planted it, but I have for many years campaigned for a large-scale prevalence study, a prospective study that is, yes, it's not going to be cheap to do, but it's going to be very helpful. We need to follow people up through the years, not just people who are receiving treatment, but people in general, to understand what contributes to different gambling behaviors, how those gambling behaviors evolve over time. At the moment, we know how many people are in treatment each year, but we don't really know whether it's an identical population to the one 10 years ago, or whether, we know that only 5% of people are in treatment, but who are the other 95%? What are they spending their money on? What types of gambling are they doing? So my suggestion is that we really invest in an independent study that takes the last 10, 20 years to really continue feeding back to us, the population, what we are witnessing, what products are the most harmful and why, what are the consequences, and how much are people playing specific products.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Professor Balmer-Jones. Welcome. Thank you so much for coming. No, not at all. I know that you also have to leave quite speedily, so I'm going to come
Okay, let me check why I'm doing that. I think I'm okay. Unless I've missed something. I think I'm all right.
Perfect. All right.
Well, by all means.
Well, you were due to be first, so we'll go to you next. Saying that the big question of this panel is really where the government is with the white paper. Serena, where do you think the government is sitting in terms of this white paper?
We should come to you last now. It's first of all, it's great to be here, and thanks to this, and also good to be with Henrietta here. We've been campaigning on for some time. It's not altogether certain where the government is quite now because of the change. The last government was probably dragging its feet on the white paper. If we think about who was keen on it at the time, well, the present chief secretary, who's now become the chief secretary, he still remains very keen. I saw him, I think this morning, briefly. I bumped into him and I just said, we have to talk about this. He said, yes. He said, I'm still very keen, which is quite reasonable. And I said, well, we need to talk about it because we need to figure out exactly whether we're going to get this through or not. There are others who are not so keen on it, but they were always there anyway. So you'll get pushback from the Treasury almost certainly. They would throw at you the revenues that they receive and all the other things. And my point, therefore, is that it's still a bit of a work in progress. Not that they may want to look at it again. I'm due to see a couple of people in the course of the next 24 hours. And so hopefully I'll get a better view on it. But we're still carrying on. I keep saying to everybody, I've been to the Downing Street to say, this is a paper, the white paper has to be published. I don't think you can bury it because, we're just not going to let it be buried. We're going to make an issue of it. And there are lots of things about it, but there are others who are obviously opposed to it. So they're making the alternative case. So the balance of arguments remains much as it was before. But we should do it. No question.
We were just talking about the new atmosphere of slightly being opposed to so-called nanny state interventions. We've seen what's happened with online harms and obesity. Is the fact that gambling wasn't mentioned among these other things by the government a good sign?
Yeah, it is. I mean, the online harms bill had significant problems in it. It wasn't right. There were lots of issues that surrounding it. So their view on this is the side effects of that. The gambling stuff is not in the same place as that was. It's very clear. The white paper was thrashed through. There was a balance in it. I mean, actually, it's a compromise, really, in a way, the white paper, because some of us would have liked to have seen it gone further. But as I understand it, the white paper was a bit of a compromise on this. So no, I remain optimistic. It's going to be one of those things where the government will have to balance the time they have for doing it and whether or not they're driven to do it for the right reasons. And that's really a game of persuasion, I guess. And as I say, the last administration still hadn't committed to doing it either. So this is not a shift. It's stasis at the moment. That's where we are. So we still have, as I say, I remain optimistic of the need to get it out there and of those who are closer to it understanding that. As I say, the President Chief Secretary himself critical to this, so we've yet to do some work on it.
So is there a case perhaps that this fits in well with the government under Truss? Is there any case to be made that it's more likely that we'll see this reform under Truss?
No, I think it's neither more or less likely. Is that going to be obtuse? I just mean to say that it's still, we were still going to have to persuade the previous administration, so we weren't home and dry. So don't assume for a second this is a retraction. It's not. It's in exactly the same place as it was before. The problem is that names have all changed, and people who therefore knew something about it are no longer in the posts that they were. So that's the problem. So it's a case of re-education and getting people to understand what they're sitting on, why it's necessary. So that may take a little bit more time. But as I say, nobody has come out with an absolute no, this should not go through. It's about saying to people, this is an important thing. We need to get it done. Here are the reasons why we need to get it done. So it's up to myself and others to get to ministers and to set up those conversations around that. So,
and have you spoken to Michelle Donlan yet?
I have spoken to Michelle, and we are due to talk again. I think she is completely new to the idea of it, but I know that the Chief Secretary is also committed to talking to as well. So we will
That's
definitely have those conversations after this conference. It's been difficult up until the conference because everybody gets focused on these panjandrums. God knows why. But afterwards, then when they get down to the reality of what they're doing in the departments, that's when I think we can go and visit when the air is cleared and we start looking at what they need to do.
And just finally, do you think, in terms of the longer term future, do you think that supposing this does get published in the near future, is there a further aim that you have brewing on the horizon that you want to see?
Well, it depends how much of this would require legislation. So a white paper is a clear indication of legislative intent. Otherwise, it would be a green paper. So a white paper tells you where you're meant to be going with legislation. And there are some things in this white paper which won't necessarily need legislation. So the question is really when it comes to setting up the fund, as it were, does that need legislation? If it's not statutory and it's voluntary, all these things are what remains in the white paper. If it's voluntary, then that is a much easier thing to get through well enough at pace than statutory, which will have to be taken through as legislation. So yeah, I think there are some things that we'll get through quite quickly, and others that, if they're more longer term, we'll have to take legislation. Then it's always bidding for a legislative slot. But you can probably piggyback some of this on other legislation going through us. But
yes, and I understand the salient point for this is that a lot of the changes are tweaks or updates to existing legislation.
that's exactly right.
So it doesn't present as a whole lot of new
it's an
laws that the government might be kind of worried about introducing.
Well, always in politics, the thing I've learned most in the years of failure and success, and more failure than success, is to take the hurdle that's in front of you first. The hurdle in front of us is the white paper. If we get the white paper in, then that is a commitment by the government of intent to necessarily legislate where required, but to implement. You don't publish a white paper without having the intention to legislate, which is why the government will be cautious about publishing the white paper, because they know what it means after that. Is that we'll all be able to get at them and say, but you published the white paper, so now you have to see it through.
Yes.
So that's where the debate is. Once you publish a white paper, that is your position. And at that stage, there will be rows and arguments, no doubt, continuing. But the key thing is that's where the government is. Up until now, it's a debate in that government. Once the white paper is published, it's a reality. And that's our hurdle. Once we're through that, then it's a matter of taking them as fast as possible to implementation across a range of those elements of the white paper, some legislative, some non-legislative.
And just finally, can you just give us a quick overview of of the journey that this white paper has taken so far? Because it's been quite a long and frustrating one, hasn't it, with lots of blockages, but you've managed to get it to this point.
Yeah, I mean, it's been it's been a fight. Governments always, the Treasury will always get weighing in when they think it's going to affect revenues. It's not going to affect revenues at all, but that will be always the argument. The more you disturb the nature of how the industry works, etc., then that becomes an issue. But I think the getting the message about the damage that's done by a kind of really in a peculiar way, the most unregulated industry that I've come across, which even Labour admits the mistake they made at the time was to set off down this road without having at least some guiding regulations in it. Of course, before the online stuff became big, but now, of course, you can see what the problems are around that, and eradicating the issues and the problems without, getting to the heart of damaging people's desire if they want to gamble or whatever, but stopping those abuses taking place, which then lead to serious human harms. And I think that's always a more difficult argument to make. We've been making that argument. We've got the evidence. We've got so many of the families that have been damaged by this, by the targeting through things like VIP rooms and all those sort of things becoming much better known. And all of these are about abuses. They're not about a legitimate and reasonable marketplace. They are about abuses and about an industry that feeds on failure, as it were, rather than about success. So, choice still exists, but the question is, where are the limits of the way in which you get people to make choices is the game, really, I think. And that's where we've made progress. We have made progress. I mean, lots and lots of people in the House across both sides are keen to see change. So it's not just one side, it's not just Labour, it's also conservatives, but not everybody. So there is opposition.
If you're sure you can save for the questions at the end. What I was going to do is bring in questions.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Well, then I'll move on to Ravi.
Thank you.
You've written a lot on the techniques that online gambling operators use to market to vulnerable people. This mirrors data harvesting by many other operators. Can you tell us a bit about those techniques, how
Sure.
vulnerable people are targeted, and what can be done to prevent
Sure.
it?
So a couple of things. Firstly, I haven't written about that. I've acted for individuals. And
Sorry.
no, it's a fair comment. But to be clear, this gambling is not directly my area of expertise. I'm a tech lawyer. I act in data protection cases. I sue big tech companies. I look at the data flows through how online industries work. And an increasing part of my instructions is challenging how the gambling industry operates. And it's through that I see that online gambling is a particularly egregious example of the effects of behavioral data and that kind of profiling and how personal information can be weaponized. What you see in the gambling context, particularly, is vulnerabilities being turned into code. And that work that we've been doing has garnered international and national press. We've had stories in the Financial Times, the BBC, and the New York Times did a big long read about how this is all working in the UK, because the UK is seen internationally as a petri dish for how online gambling works and the dangers that come with it. And as part of those growing instructions, we've been instructed by Clean Up Gambling to prepare submissions for the Gambling Act review. And that review itself recognised there are peculiar dangers posed by online gambling. And as it says in the consultation, the use of data in real time. And it's that data, that personal information, and how it's used to target individuals that causes a lot of concern. Of course, the reason that we're here, the things that Ian and Henrietta talked about. And to really understand how those data flows happen, I really encourage everyone that's interested in this area to look at a report that Clean Up Gambling did, looking at the data flows in the industry and how third-party surveillance companies are used to help target individuals. And the report really revealed how the industry creates profiles by constant, continual monitoring of offline and online behavior, including somebody's propensity to gamble, how often your emails get opened, your win-back margin, what you're influenced by, all of these categories that are only being used to target people. It's really pernicious. And our submissions made a series of recommendations for reform. I'll just give you three of the highlight ones, I think. A code of conduct for how the industry uses data, like we saw with the age-appropriate design code. We've been talking about online harms. When the online harms, the first talking of it came out in this consultation, remote gambling was seen as a industry that was designed and that should be regulated as part of the online harms. And thirdly, when Henrietta was talking about large data sets going to researchers, I think that's a really good idea, but that needs independent oversight. It cannot just be the industry's trying to push things through. So I'm really glad to see there is movement towards legislative reform, because it's a really fragmented space right now, and people that are impacted by this, the people that try to say something's happening to me, this isn't right, do not know where to turn. You have data missions from the Information Commission's office, you've got the Gambling Commission, you've got all these regulators, and a lot of this is just falling into the stores. So it's really good to see that we're here talking about this and trying to bring it all together to protect people. It's a real world harm.
And yeah, and these are techniques that are used everywhere by all kinds of operators, but they're even worse when it comes to gambling companies.
Yeah.
Even more advanced. And
So-
more efficient.
So the idea that people are subject to profiling online, the way they behave online, is quite well known.
Yeah.
The legality of that is still being tested. A lot of our work is still testing that in the general online sphere. But because you can take vulnerabilities, you can use the same techniques you do to show somebody advert for shoes or going on a flight. You can take those same technology to say, I know when you're going to gamble, how to keep you hooked, how to press those buttons to turn your general, just normal play into addictive behavior, how to recognize those addictions. And it's that yin and yang of being able to say, well, this person might be vulnerable, so should we protect them? Or this person is vulnerable to addiction, so how do we target them? How do we keep them hooked?
Yes.
That needs real independent oversight and real scrutiny. I don't think is lawful as it currently stands. It needs enforcement of the existing laws as well.
Fantastic. That's very incredibly interesting. Thank you. And I will now come to our final panelist, Matt, our cousin. You worked as a leading campaigner for many years. Can you tell us about some of the process that you've been involved in campaigning and what the blockages are? And then also, you've done a great deal of research as to what the public want to see in gambling reform. And can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Martha. I'll certainly address those questions in the course of what I'm about to say. So my focus will be on online gambling. Obviously, the reform agenda is focused primarily on online gambling. That's where most of the harm is. And the Conservative Manifesto committed to bringing our analogue legislation into the digital age. That's the crucial element here. It's the fact that our legislation is outdated, and it was conceived of in a review in 2001 by Sir Alan Budd. That then became the 2005 Gambling Act, which was then enacted in 2007. And between 2007 and 2014, we didn't regulate online gambling. The Gambling Commission had no licensing regime. And I'll come on to the consequences of that in a second. So why is this urgent? We often hear the headline rate prevalence of problem gambling as a reason why we shouldn't focus on this, but the range of estimates of problem gambling fall between 0.2% from the Gambling Commission telephone surveys to 2.7% from the Gamble Aware Needs Assessment carried out by YouGov, which is about 1.4 million people. That's probably somewhere in between, but work is being done by the Gambling Commission to ascertain exactly what the proportion is of the population. But in overall, I'll take questions at the end.
No, just to say,
I'll take questions at the end. Thanks. But I think really, given the focus is on online gambling, we should really focus on that particular sector and the harms that arise from that sector if we're seeking to reform regulation of it. So if we look at, for example, the David Forrest research that was commissioned by Gamble Aware again, found that 86% of the profits are coming from the 5% highest spenders. If you look at the Gambling Industry Select Committee from the House of Lords, it found that 60% of the profits are coming from the 5% people who are either addicted or at risk. So a huge proportion of profits from the sector is coming from people that are losing more than they can afford. And when you have really an extractive sector like online gambling is at the moment, and I mean extractive, it's extractive from both the player through things as Sirian talked about, VIP schemes and cross-selling. So if you sign up to a gambling site to bet on football or racing or sports or whatever, you'll be cross-sold slots through free bets and inducements. And the reason for that is because the proportion of people that are addicted or at risk who engage with online slots is somewhere between 40 and 50%. The vast majority of profits from the sector are also coming from online slots. So it's between 6 and 7 billion a year, and about half is coming from online slots. So that's the reality of the industry. It's to get the customer onto the addictive product as quickly as possible. And then combine that with the bonuses and inducements, which are informed by some of the data profiling that Ravi talked about. And also the excessive marketing that goes with it. When you've got the customer base where the vast majority of your revenues are coming from people who are addicted or at risk, they're very likely to go broke, and you need new customers to replace them. And that's why you see about 1.5 billion a year spent on marketing out of the 7 billion that's lost to online gambling. And it's not just extracted from the player, it's extracted from the country. So between 2007 and 2014, maybe one went offshore, went to tax havens, they avoided UK corporation tax. Not only did they avoid UK corporation tax, but they weren't taxed at the point of consumption until 2014, when online gambling was licensed by the Gambling Commission. The point of consumption tax, by international standards, is still very low. It's 21%, even in spite of corporation tax being avoided. If you compare that to, for example, the US in New York, they've set a limit, an initial limit of 12 licenses, and they're levying tax at 50%. And they're saying you have to have all the server, the operational functions, everything in the state if you want to be licensed. And Flutter, which is one of the bigger operators in the UK, we're quite happy to subscribe to that to get licensed in New York. So I think that there are lots of things that other jurisdictions that are starting to legalise online gambling have learned from our mistakes, have learned from where we went wrong. And because they're building a regulatory framework from the ground up, they're able to address a lot of the things that we didn't address initially. Really, what we've done is play catch up since 2014, trying to retrofit regulations to a sector that really behaved exactly as however it wanted. There was no real regulation of the sector. So I think when you've got a sector as well that still employs most people offshore, where the online gambling specifically, you're effectively sending billions of pounds to offshore entities where you're getting no employment benefit, no real economic benefits being realised onshore. And you're also, if you look at the Public Health England estimate, it's costing the country £1.27 billion a year to treat addiction and the consequence of addiction. So as the SMF found in some of the work they've done, it's no net economic benefit to the sector. Now, prevention is obviously much cheaper than having to treat addiction. And there are some things that we can do to prevent gambling related harm and prevent those costs. I think it's a no-brainer now, particularly with Brexit, to insist on these companies coming back onshore. And if they want to be licensed to be based here and have their operational functions here and to pay tax here, all their taxes here, I don't see why we can't do that at a minimum. But I think really there's so much public support for the gambling reform agenda if you look at the polling by specific reforms. And I'll just go through some of them. I mean, the Ombudsman, at the moment, there's no consumer ombudsman, there's no gambling ombudsman. If you're not paid out by a gambling operator, if you're exploited in any way, you rely on industry-funded dispute resolution services, which are not fit for purpose. There needs to be an independent ombudsman, and there's obviously huge support for that. I think stake limits on online slots, the most addictive product. I think, as I mentioned, more than 50% of the profits, 45% of people that use them addicted or at risk. The reduction in the stake on fixed odds betting terminals, which was a Conservative government that enacted that was a hugely successful policy. And obviously campaigned for some time to get that introduced. But if you look at police call-outs to betting shops, declined significantly. If you look at the number of people presenting with a gambling addiction, accessing a national gambling treatment service, the numbers of people who cite fixed odds betting terminals is down. It's down about 90%. So this is a very successful policy. It's not about banning gambling. It's about making the most addictive products safer. And I think we have to look at applying those principles to the similar products online. There's also other things. I'm really sorry.
I just want to make sure everyone has time to answer questions.
I'm sorry. I'll wrap up.
It's absolutely fascinating. You can squeeze it into as short a time as possible.
Yeah, I'm really sorry. So the other things are, at the moment, operators are supposed to do affordability checks anyway, and it's about standardising that process, where that threshold takes place, where that threshold of the check of losses means a check has to take place. And the SMF has done some good work on this. They've suggested £100 a month. The debate should be really what happens when that check takes place as well. Like, how is affordability determined for gambling? As I say, they're supposed to do it already, but the Gambling Commission, they consider themselves an outcomes-based regulator. And when operators fall short, for example, William Hill recently were fined. 888.com were recently fined because they set someone's limit when they were earning £1,500 a month at £1,400, and they were fined for that. But really, there needs to be some standardised processes in place. And if we can get to that point, then we'll reduce the harms, and it will, ensure that gambling stays fun, which is what the intention is.
Fantastic.
Sorry about that.
No, not at all. Thank you very much indeed. I will now go to questions. If you could just, at the beginning of your question, you can say which panellist the question is directed to. That will make it very easy, or all of them. Yes.
Tom Miller from the Daily Mail. Ian and Henrietta, a lot of talk in this conference about the government getting out of the way of the business and lower regulations. Can you just draw from your personal experiences in the clinic, meeting and say why gambling is different and why why you believe it's necessary that we have more regulation?
You want me to kick off on that? Or?
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, there's always a balance to be struck when you're dealing with business and government. The balance is always you seek to eradicate the harms, but where there are no harms, you allow an industry to operate. So you don't regulate for the sake of it. In fact, I read a report called the Tigger Report, which is about deregulation in areas that are overregulated and regulation to define a market, such as medtech. So I read across the piece on that. And the point I make there is you need a basic principle about regulation. And I think we should return to the English common law system, which is you regulate when you understand that something is harmful. You don't anticipate that, but you regulate when there is evidence that something is likely to be harmful, and that business, that area of business, is therefore likely to proceeding in a way that will damage livelihoods, lives, etc., by their natural process. Seems a reasonable way to do it, not trying to anticipate years to come, but I understand that. I think with this particular issue of gambling, the mounting evidence of harms inherent in the nature of the industry should allow any government to say this is an intervention moment rather than a deregulation moment, because they aren't really regulated. So that means there's got to be intervention, because that is to limit the harms. Whether you can ever eradicate completely is a double question, but you certainly seek to limit the nature of the harms that are happening within that industry and the way it practices itself. So for the government, I'm very happy to sit down with them and to talk them through what regulation is all about. You can't be against regulation. You are in favor of the right regulation. And that's really where the debate is, not we're very against regulation. No, because I'm in favor of regulation where it's necessary. But when there's evidence, and there's strong overriding evidence now that this industry is, a number of its practices are abusive and are leading to harm in the human condition, but also in the economic situation, because this is a business which is ill set financially as well, by the way, because it leads to corruption and problems financially as much as it leads to harms in human conditions. So it needs to be regulated, and that's the way I would approach it. And I will argue that quite happily with government as long as they want to sit in the room with me. I think I know a little bit better than someone about what regulation looks like and what it shouldn't be, and that's really the main one.
Great, thank you. And Henrietta?
Such a perfect answer. I agree with everything. But just from a personal human perspective, I will just draw your attention to the suffering that is not just about the individual. Before running the National Problem Gambling Clinic, I used to run the inpatient services for drugs and alcohol for the whole of central London. And the pain and the harm were very much, of course, they impacted on the family, but the financial consequences weren't as great. So the impact on the family's ability to continue, for the spouse to continue looking after the children, for the family to remain in the same home, that wasn't as great in relation to harm. The thing that shocked me when I started seeing thousands and thousands of people with gambling disorder was the generational harm that was transmitted through, not just through the anxiety and the depression and the fear in the children of the gamblers and the parents and the spouses, but also the instability economically, the fact that a lot of people lose their homes, they start getting chased by moneylenders, they have to escape different locations, different schools these children move around in, and then eventually a lot of the children end up either with psychiatric disorders or gamblers themselves. And it's horrible. And so when I look at people now in my clinic who show up, and half of them often have, at any one time, will have parents who are gamblers. It's a cycle that's vicious, and breaking it, as Ian has been saying, is vital. Yes.
Ben Objecti, Consumer Recruitment Services. I think my question is probably to Sirian and to Matt. This is about legacy gambling premises. I live in Wood Green. It's quite a poor area. Lots of gang activity. It's probably the highest murder rate in London over the past couple of years. I imagine most people in this room have no idea where their local gambling shop is, but within a mile and a half of where I live, there are 30 gambling shops, which includes 1% of Ladbrokes' entire UK portfolio. National average is 1.6 gambling premises per 10,000 people. Where I live, it's 10.9. So what should we be doing within the new reforms to look at removing the exploitation of poor areas by gambling operators?
Sorry, the two panelists you wanted to ask that to was
So
Syrian
to Syrian and to Matt.
and Matt. Should we go to Matt first?
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. What's your name, sir?
Ben.
Ben. So there are limits to what councils can do because of the statutory aim to permit. So councils are required to aim to permit licenses subject to reasonable consistency with the licensing objectives. That's very difficult to refuse an application on the basis of, when the licensing objectives are the gambling should be fair and open, not associated with crime, and it can't harm the young and vulnerable. It's difficult to argue that a premises is going to do any of those things if it hasn't opened yet. And because of aim to permit, it's very difficult for licensing authorities, unless there's an example. For example, like if a shop wants to open near a creche or something, it's very difficult to argue or object on the basis of harm to the young and vulnerable. So I think what the white paper absolutely has to do is, because local authorities, they have a dual responsibility to uphold those licensing objectives with the Gambling Commission. So the white paper absolutely has to give local authorities more power and more discretion to refuse these sorts of applications, to make those judgments on a local level. At the moment, yeah, it's extremely difficult.
It's difficult under planning, I accept, and I think that one of the issues that people don't recognise is that if you want to define what an area that's in significant poverty looks like, just go and count the gambling shops, and just in case you were missing that, that's where you'll be. It's a fact of life. It's been like that for a long time. I'm not against the physical premises gambling. I think that they're easier to control than the online side of it, and obviously there are issues there. But I think there are limits to the amount that would offer what you call competition in an area like that, because the problem often is that people will spend their income rather than getting back to the family with it and get addicted and therefore lose it. So there needs to be greater controls in that regard. But and so I understand that. The key, I would say, though, a lot of those people will be sitting at home spending a huge amount of money already on the online services, and it's the online services which can wreak even further havoc. So my question is yes, but I think the key issue here is to deal with the nature of the addiction and what's happening as part of that process to try and get people off that, at the same time as though they are also gambling at home online through the late night hours when those shops are closed. So it's properly here.
Yes.
Anna Wallace from Hackney, and we talked a little bit about the comparison of the online safety bill and the fact that that might have to be refined somewhat in order to get through. Question to Matt and Sir Ian: if the gambling white paper has to go through a similar process of refining, what of the many interesting measures that you've talked about would you prioritise? Perhaps you just sort of top three.
My top three would be stake limits for online slots in line with fixed odds betting terminals. Introduce actually a regime of stake and prize regulations in the same way machines are regulated. I would say an ombudsman. I think a consumer ombudsman is really important. At the moment, it's an access to justice issue. People are exploited. They can't afford to take private litigation on. And I would also say that it's a question of more resources for the Gambling Commission. I think the Gambling Commission absolutely needs a wider remit. It needs more resources. It needs to be better staffed. It needs to have more powers of audit in real time of what the operators are up to. And I think that really is the foundation for a lot of regulatory reform.
Well, there's a lot in what Matt just said. The one thing I would add, the two things I would specify as my priorities. One is that the Gambling Commission has much greater powers to investigate and to fine where necessary and to pursue individuals. If people have been involved in poor practices, then they should lose their right to be directors of companies. Those are the sort of punishments that really make people sit up. And there's been an element to that. And the second bit, I think, is the levy. I think, that we talked about the cost to the NHS, but honestly, I think we need to have a more generous levy. Now, it may be that we have to compromise over that, so it's not statutory, whatever. I understand the government push back on that, but one way or the other, we need to find a way so that there's more money going in to help those who've actually got themselves caught up in this one way or the other, and you can get them off it again, and that requires money. And gambles into makes a lot of money, is very profitable, and putting that money back should be the key. I did have a discussion actually with a couple of other people. Philip Davis is one, and he said he wasn't against a levy. He said providing that those who are in fixed locations, such as betting shops, as it were, recognise their overheads are much different from those when the gambling companies specifying very much online work. So there need to be some rationalised recognition of that, which I wouldn't have a problem with at all, because the real target here is the online work really, and the harms that come from that. So the overall companies themselves will just need to look at it. Small little businesses is a different matter altogether, but we can get some accommodation. But the levy is critical, I think, because it's the treatment element which is really important, because we need to get the balance back into an industry. We're not against, just not against gambling. And people have always had flutters and hey, I don't do it regularly, occasionally. But my point is, these are choices made that are ultimately reasonably rational. What we've got here is we've got to get those who are no longer making rational choices about what they're doing. We need to get them their treatment sorted and paid for, and you can't do that without feeding off the other budgets that we may talk about, such as the health service budget and others. So a levy that helps recognise there are harms from an industry like this, the byproduct, I think a generous sport group would actually pay up for that. And if not,
Does anyone have a question for Ravi? Our panelist hasn't been asked one yet. Yes?
It partly bears on that. In terms of, also to Professor Jones, I've noticed that quite a lot of the computer games directed at children, some very popular ones like Roblox, involve a gambling component, that albeit you don't win real money, you still have to spend real money to participate in it. So partly on the data side, do you think there's a good reason for an outright prohibition on data regarding this of under 18s being marketed at all? And to the professor, with young minds developing and having experience of, albeit simulated gambling in computer games, do you think there's a case for the outright prohibition of even simulated gambling being aimed towards children in games that they play?
Do you go first?
Yeah. So in terms of those kind of the way games work and online games and then kind of simulation games, I'm acting with an organisation called the Five Rights Foundation, who are doing a lot of fantastic work in this space, looking at how children's data is used and protecting children. And we're doing some cases about how these platforms operate lawful. I think it's questionable, and I think given that we have a particular code for how children should be protected online, in the age-appropriate design code, there needs to be greater scrutiny, and not just on these kind of platforms, but also bigger platforms like Instagram and other platforms that use children's data. So I definitely think there is good law, it just needs to be enforced.
In 2019, I founded this National Centre for Gaming Disorders to understand what was it that young people were doing when they were experiencing harm from gaming, not gambling. I'm just dividing in case some people in the room are not clear. I thought I might just see 50 people a year. We've seen hundreds and hundreds of referrals come in. We have a sort of 5-month waiting list, and this is more and more people being employed. We're seeing also, I think it was 68 different games being played. However, what I am clear about is that some young people are attracted to loot box-like activities. Now, there will be a bidirectionality there in relation to the loot boxes themselves potentially attracting people who are going to be attracted to gambling when they're older, but equally doing something at that young age that is clearly a gambling-like behavior is undoubtedly going to influence their future vulnerability. So David Zendel is the expert on this kind of work, and he showed that there were far more people when they got older who did have problems with gambling, who were originally involved with loot box gaming. I think it's a world that needs a lot more research and work. Remember, we are the only clinic in the country. What we are seeing is only a drop in relation to the numbers that may require help. Having said this, many people are loving and enjoying playing doing gaming and there's no problem with it at all, you know. So we're not saying it's a bad activity in any way. Just saying some people are having a problem. The loot boxes, in my opinion, should have gone under the Gambling Commission because I think they can, for some sector of the population, be problematic and potentially lead to harm later on.
Next question. Yes.
Tom Hunter from Dogs Group and the House magazine. I've got a question for Professor Bowden-Jones and Matt. It's about actually around young people, particularly 18 and 25-year-olds. And if you could speak to the impact that you've seen on them and also what the policy suggestions might be beyond recommendations you discussed today.
Would you like me to say just very briefly? I would just like to say that I am part of my national problem gambling clinic is also the young people service, and I was hopeful that I might not need to see many people in that service because it's illegal to gamble, and because I was just hoping. But what we are seeing are tremendous negative impacts on students. When people leave, whereas the gamers are all young at home being referred by their families, the students are desperately under the illusion that gambling is going to give them more money to continue studying. And instead, what we constantly see is people whose lives have been destroyed by gambling. I will just point to the fact that young people have higher levels of impulsivity. They have less ability to postpone gratification. The maturation of their brains has not fully yet happened by the time they're 18, 19, 20, when they're needing to sort out their finances. And often they're leaving home for the first time and needing to manage these funds. So there are many risk factors. If it was, you know, in my opinion, it would have been quite nice from a gambling risk perspective to raise those age limits and allow people to have more control of their funds, let's say at 25 onwards, rather than assume an adult is an adult at 18 when you know they're not able to postpone their gratification in the same way. So it's been heartbreaking. Students are coming forward and we know they're struggling. And unfortunately, with the recent economic climate, we may end up seeing more students thinking that somehow they can, you know, they can win money. Sorry, it was a bit longer than I thought.
That's okay. So the brain doesn't, on average, develop fully until you're 25, and the last bit to develop is the prefrontal cortex, which is the bit that allows you to regulate behaviour more efficiently. And obviously, with the advertising around football, particularly, and we haven't really spoke much about advertising, but like, I mean, apart from direct advertising, but football is an interesting example of where a child growing up watching their team wearing the shirt, because they all want to wear the adult shirts, they want to wear the real ones with a betting sponsor on it, and just sort of having that association, and then as soon as they turn 18, download all the gambling apps. They've been watching the advertising, they've been becoming familiar with all the brands, download the gambling apps, take advantage of all those offers, and that is the age at 18, particularly young men, where you are the most likely to develop a gambling addiction. So I think that advertising is really a lever. We talked about briefly what could be kind of compromised away or whatever, but I think advertising is sort of a lever you can pull where if the sector is regulated to be safe and there's less harm, then you could probably justify more advertising. But at the moment, the way the sector currently operates, I feel like it's very little kind of argument or convincing argument to allow this type of advertising in and around football. I think at the very least that has to go.
We have time for about 2 more questions. Yes.
It's to all the panel. It's an observation to help other people in the room as well. My first thought is, I don't know how many people know what a VIP means, but put it this way. One of my best friends is Kay Wadsworth. Kay Wadsworth is a member of Gambling with Lives. Her daughter took her life at 32 because of gambling debts. She hung herself. Her mother was out in Portugal at the time. She'd seen her only a week before. As far as she was concerned, she was a happy, normal 32-year-old. She had received an email that basically said, you are a VIP. We will fly you first class to a country. We will put you up in this particular world-class hotel. You can eat, drink, do whatever you want. All we ask is that you play on the tables. There's no such thing as a free lunch. The problem with the gambling industry, as I see it at the moment, is that the advertising sector will take certain things like, set your own limits and all the latest bit of whatever is the fluffery that's going on. But what we need to do is to stop this kind of gambling is fun, which has become the new norm now. Oh, look, yeah, we can do this, we can do that. It's fun. Do it with your friends. It's fun. It's not fun when it claims lives. And as you say, 1.27 billion a year to treat addiction, and we're not really getting the money in. I was at an event earlier on, and Bet365 was held up as a wonderful example of a startup company that has done brilliantly. And what is Bet365? It's a gambling company.
Thank you. Who is your question?
It's to everybody. What do you think about this kind of element of advertising that's saying it's fun?
Yeah.
What do you think about, as you mentioned earlier on, the 1.27 billion a year to treat addiction, and we've got no way of getting that money back?
Thank you. Ian, do you want to start? And we'll move along the calendar. That can serve as everyone's closing
Well,
remarks.
to be fair, I've not much to add to my previous comments. I mean, we need to get the white paper out to deal with the abuses and the excesses in an industry. That an industry can operate is one argument, but it's where the limits of operation are. That's really what we're dealing with. And so, dealing with these cases and issues that you said to will be covered in the white paper. That's the whole idea of it. So, and getting money to help treat people on these things is again in the white paper. So, I guess the only answer I can give is the white paper out pretty much quick as we can. To be fair, it's not about crushing an industry, not about saying we will never have that industry. That I don't think works, because then you have all sorts of alternatives. My point is just getting this into a place where people aren't abused, and where when things go very badly wrong, there is a way in which we can help them.
Yes, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to say crush the industry.
Yeah, no, I'm just saying that's the nature of it. So it's about balance, really, and I would hope that the gambling companies would be reasonable and rational about this in their response to it, rather than trying to see it as some kind of ridiculous attempt to crush them. It's not. I think it's about balance, really. Businesses set up and start. We just don't want them to be abusive. We wouldn't want it in any other region. That's why we're happy with it in Camden.
I think we have to leave the room in 1 minute, but if you can all say a couple of any
Yeah,
thoughts,
I
any
mean,
last words.
Acting for individuals that have been impacted by the industry, the one thing that really frustrates me is the lack of transparency, the opacity of how the profiling occurs, the amount of work you have to do to understand that you have been targeted, how you've been targeted has to be reformed. And also, Mr. Ritchie from Clean Up Gambling is here. Clean Up Gambling, a great organisation. Gambling Lives. I'm glad that we do some pro bono work with them. Really, really great organisation.
Just 2 words from me. I would very much like, if anyone knows how soon the white paper is going to be published, to have a conversation about that before we leave today. Thank you.
And Matt.
Just say, pick up on the last point that was made. It's not enough. I mean, you've basically got a sector that funds advertising saying gamble responsibly, but at the same time trying to get their customers addicted or extract as much as they can out of addicted customers. It's extremely paradoxical. We can't treat away gambling addiction. Anyone can be harmed by gambling. The best prevention is always better than cure. And if we take a genuine public health approach to this, and we actually have the right regulations that fit for this digital age, that we can make huge progress.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, everyone, for coming. Very much. Thank you for coming.
No, no. All tragic.